Once we have our mesh and our surface volumes generated, we can go to the next step, which is to really look at ways of elaborating the surface. And for now, I'm actually just going to look at the mesh side of things. Once you have a mesh, you can say simply reduce the mesh. So under the mesh drop-down menu, we can go to Edit Tools and Reduce Mesh. Now it starts by saying you have 960 faces. What do you want to reduce that to? Otherwise known as polygons. And how extreme we can go, I don't know. Let's start with 500, so roughly in half, and we'll do a preview of that. And so you can see it's starting to break them down. It's not uniform. Reduced mesh rarely gives you anything that's uniform. So let's go even further to say 200. Okay, so it's again further sort of broken up. Any sort of symmetry is starting to get lost. And then the extreme, I don't know how low you could go. Let's try 10. Right, so at some point you lose all legibility. So let's move it up a little bit to say 40. See what that gives us. Okay, and I had it at 50 and that wasn't so bad. But so we want to sort of maintain some approximation of the egg, and that looks like we have it. So, and again, this is a mesh, so if I were to select it and turn on our control points, it would show us all of the control vertices, which are at the edges of all of the segments. So I could theoretically select one and manipulate it further. So one thing that might be interesting is to go in and use each face as a control structure for another curve. So let's say I'll start with this triangle, and I will using the just the control point curve. I'll click on one, the next, the third, and then I'll come back to the first one to complete it. And in every case, you will have a closed curve that is based on each triangle. Because, by the way, that we reduced the mesh of this volume to the extent that it doesn't appear that there are any, quote, there's one quad face, right, and one or two quad faces. Everything else is a triangle. So that's not to say that this wouldn't work on that face as well, right? So this could be one approach, is to determine a sort of density for a reduced mesh, and then start to kind of emboss or elaborate that surface with something else. And I get what I'm getting at here is that this wouldn't be, this is simply just, we're literally kind of creating a curve on the face of each of these polygons. So you could go back, and I believe I'd have to explode this. Let me try doing it without. And because it's a mesh, we have to stay within the mesh tools. You could go down to, let's see, Mesh Boolean, or rather maybe Mesh Edit and Mesh Trim. Right? Then we could select some cutting objects, which in this case would be our curves, and then it asks us to select object to trim. Right, and actually we would probably want the opposite, so let's do that again. So we'll select select object to trim, and you can go in That's interesting. It's starting to mirror it. And then you can, as you can see, we're starting to get some kind of patterning out of this. Now, one thing to note is that this is not a volume any longer. Once we trimmed the hole, it became a surface or an open mesh. So if we go back to the original mesh, it's a closed mesh. But if we come in and mesh trim even a single opening, suddenly it's an open mesh, which would present a problem for 3D printing. So if this is done, you'd have to work with a second inner shell, most likely, that you would then weld or join the faces or polygons together to create a volume, or really a shelled volume. I'm not quite sure why it's actually trimming down below, so I'm going to run that again. So this is my cutting object. Interesting, it's projecting it down. So, so this is one approach I think would be interesting to explore. So another would be to actually take in this case, those vertices, and use them as kind of guide points for other geometry. So in this case, we could start with a polyline or a control point curve. It doesn't really matter for this process. We'll use a polyline, and what I'm going to do is start, in this case, in the bottom, and I will start to select a series of points. You know, and again, you could change this up if you wanted, but the point is that I'm trying to maintain some consistency to this. There. So I gave a little zigzag in the middle. Regardless, we now have our curve. So what I'd like to do is ultimately I will be either lofting or sweeping this surface, so or a surface with this curve, but I first need to copy it, and I'm going to radially copy this so that it always moves about the central axis of the egg. So now we can use our Rotate 3D tool, and since the curve is already pre-selected, it's just asking me for the rotation axis, which I have, and then it brings up our little rotation gizmo, and I have snap on, so it's going to snap to the next module, which is all I want, right? So we're just going to snap one, and make sure that copy is set to yes, otherwise you're just going to move, and we want to actually copy it. So now we have two, or a pair of curves. So I will, just for clarity, pull these out, copy them out, holding Alt. You can see what we have. So let's see. So why don't I go ahead and just try lofting that. So select curves to loft, and there we go. And it's a little rough because I chose straight sections. So if I go back to loft and select one then the other, it gives me some options. Let's try normal. So I change the drop down to normal in preview. It doesn't make much of a difference. So I want to rebuild, and what rebuilding does is get rid of the individual segments and really converts this to the edges to curves with a set number of control points. So there you have it. So I think this will be more effective for what we want to do. So we hit OK. Now, the real challenge is to take this single strand and rotate it a number of times to redefine the egg volume. So why don't we select this, and we'll go back to our revolve tool, and then select curves. Actually, we want to revolve, or sorry, rotate 3D, and then select objects, and our axis is the top, the bottom, and then we need 2 reference points. So I have that from my original curve, which it's important to retain because that has information that the new surface doesn't. So we'll start here and we'll rotate to the next one. Okay. Alright, so this is what we get. And what you'll notice is that it is seamless from one to the next, right? These little guys are sort of a distraction. So all we would need to do is to continue that process around the entire volume. So maybe to make things easier, I'll bring this over, because this, and that's simply for a series of points to snap to. So I'll select the newly copied surface, and I will rotate 3D, and we always have to define our rotational axis. And then now you can see the original curve I created lines up with the mesh facets. So now I can just start on one and go to the next and keep moving. Let's see how we're doing. There we go. So you can see that just by working with the existing mesh, a really basic mesh, you can quickly generate a series of curves that can be redefined using a surface tool, which is Loft, and then arrayed around that central axis to create any number of sort of textures or patterning. And one thing, so again, this was just a loft, so this was moving between 2 curves, so there was no information between them, so it was sort of the path of least resistance. So another, a variation of this could be to take those rails, or at least treat them as rails. Okay, so I'm going to pull off one section, and I'm going to duplicate the edges, dupe edge, and then I'll select those outer rails. Okay, hit enter, and then I'll delete this so that we only have the outer rails. And what this allows us to do is then come back and define the profile that's going to get swept along the rails. So I'll just use, let's see, why don't I use, I could even just use a circle. And I may just fix that a little bit. Okay, so now there's actually going to be some relief to that section. I should usually I have a start and end profile, so this may not work as well as it normally does. Select first rail, select second rail, and then select cross section. All right, so it's moving in one direction. So I'd have to actually create a second profile for it to follow. But I think what we can start to see, though, is that if I were to rotate this you can see that what you're getting is something with much more relief than our original or my previous attempt. So this is something, and one thing I like to do in sort of working with surfaces is come over to the Properties tab, and you'll see that the ISO curve density is turned on. I like to turn it off just so I can get a better idea of what I actually have. And I'm in shaded render, so if I go to full render, you can start to see more closely how this thing would be expressed with a higher resolution 3D print and potentially a machined surface. But if you compare that to what we have here, I mean, you can see there's really no comparison. There's much more shadow and much more relief going on with that. So here are just a few ideas to get you started and thinking about how you might go about elaborating the surface.